We are very close to our goal of 1,000 subscribers, but I still need your support. Please don't forget to take a second and subscribe to my channel. The maple sap still steamed when she vanished. On March 12, 2005, in the rural township of Brier Hollow, Vermont, population 1,004, winter clung stubbornly to the hills. The sugar shacks scattered along County Route 19 were alive with the smell of boiling sap, smoke curling through the last of the season's snow. At 4:18 p.m., 26-year-old culinary apprentice Rebecca Hale left the Red Barn Inn, where she'd been working a temporary assignment during the annual Maple Harvest Festival. She told co-workers she was heading home to her rented cabin just half a mile down the road to rest before the dinner shift. She never arrived. By dusk, the temperature had dropped below freezing again, hardening the ruts in the muddy dirt roads. When Rebecca failed to report for her 6 p.m. shift, her supervisor assumed she'd taken ill or decided to stay home until 7:45 p.m., when the inn's owner, Douglas Quinn, called her cell phone and heard it ring faintly from somewhere beyond the parking lot. A line cook followed the sound into a narrow drainage ditch that ran along the edge of the property. There, half buried in slush, lay Rebecca's phone, its screen cracked, still faintly glowing. Her jacket and purse were later found neatly folded in the passenger seat of her old Subaru, doors locked, keys still in the ignition. There were no footprints leading away from the car, only the faint indentations of tire tracks that seemed to start and end in the same place, looping in confusion like the vehicle had been turned around several times before stopping. The first responding officer, Deputy Karen Ivers, arrived just before 8:30 p.m. and later described the scene as the quietest kind of wrong. The Red Barn Inn sat on the edge of 200 acres of forest that sloped down toward the frozen banks of the Winooski River, a place where sound carried strangely, muffled by snow and trees. Rebecca's co-workers huddled near the kitchen door, their breath visible in the cold, faces pale with disbelief. They'd all known her as meticulous, reliable, the kind of person who labeled her ingredients and cleaned her workstation twice. Her absence made no sense. Deputy Ivers secured the area, requested state police assistance, and began the grim routine of photographing everything: the phone, the car, the tire marks that went nowhere. The snow reflected the flashlight glass, erasing depth, turning the landscape into a white canvas where every shadow looked like a clue. By 10 p.m., troopers from the Vermont State Police Barracks in Waterbury had arrived. They set up portable floodlights that cast long artificial daylight across the parking lot and into the trees. The scene was methodically documented. Investigators noted that Rebecca's cell phone battery had died shortly after it was found. Her call log showed a missed call from her mother at 4:27 p.m. and an outgoing call to a number labeled Caleb Kitchen at 4:19 p.m., which lasted only 7 seconds before disconnecting. Caleb Hart was a 29-year-old sous chef who'd been working with her for 2 months. When questioned, he said Rebecca had called to ask if he needed her to bring more sugar molds from storage before she left. He'd told her no and thought nothing of it. Caleb's calm, straightforward demeanor earned him no suspicion that night, but his name would resurface again and again in the years that followed. At midnight, State Trooper Alan Crow led the first search through the surrounding woods. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees, and frostbite risk forced the teams to rotate every 30 minutes. They found nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no signs of struggle. The next morning, as sunlight turned the snow crust pink and brittle, volunteers from town joined the official search. They combed the woods with cadaver dogs, probing frozen soil with metal poles. For 5 days, they expanded the grid outward from the inn, covering over 300 acres of terrain. Helicopters scanned the frozen river. Divers drilled holes in the ice. The results were the same: nothing. It was as if the woods had swallowed Rebecca whole. Her mother, Martha Hale, arrived from Rutland on the morning of March 13th, her face raw from wind and tears. She'd spoken to Rebecca that previous night about visiting for Easter. Martha was the one who pressed investigators to treat the disappearance as foul play rather than voluntary. "My daughter doesn't run," she told reporters gathered by the snow-lined parking lot. "She finishes what she starts." The press conference footage would later become one of the most haunting images of the case: a middle-aged woman gripping a photograph of her smiling daughter, the steam from the maple boilers rising behind her like ghosts. Detective Paul Danner took over the investigation from the Vermont State Police's Major Crimes Unit. A soft-spoken man with a lined face and decades of rural homicide work behind him, Danner approached the case with methodical patience. His initial hypothesis was straightforward. Rebecca had been abducted, likely by someone she knew, within the short walk between the inn and her cabin. The lack of footprints suggested she'd entered another vehicle willingly or been forced inside before she could resist. Danner's team cataloged every employee, vendor, and guest who'd been at the inn that day. They collected fingerprints from the kitchen, the parking lot, and Rebecca's car. The forensic lab in Burlington analyzed fibers found on her seat and steering wheel, cotton blend consistent with her uniform, nothing foreign. Her phone held no unusual messages or deleted data. Her bank account and credit cards remained untouched. Within a week, the investigation began to stall under the weight of its own contradictions. Witnesses reported seeing Rebecca leaving work carrying a small paper bag and wearing her distinctive red knit cap. Two separate motorists described seeing a woman matching her description walking along County Route 19 at approximately 4:25 p.m., head down against the wind. Both accounts placed her halfway between the inn and her cabin. After that point, she vanished. The last house along that stretch of road belonged to a retired forest ranger named Douglas Pierce, who told detectives he'd been stacking firewood near his barn around that time but hadn't seen anyone. His property bordered a trail leading into the state forest, used mostly by snowmobilers and hunters. Tire impressions found near his driveway matched standard pickup truck treads, common, untraceable. Pierce's name would linger in the file as a person of interest, though no evidence ever linked him directly to the crime. Weeks passed, then months. Spring thawed the snow, revealing mud, dead leaves, and nothing else. The search of the Winooski River resumed once the ice broke, but divers found no trace of a body or belongings. The only physical item recovered after the initial week was a torn strip of white fabric discovered in April, caught on a barbed wire fence about 200 yards from where Rebecca's phone had been found. Forensic testing later determined it was part of a chef's jacket, matching the type worn at the Red Barn Inn, but the material carried no usable DNA. It was the kind of clue that could mean everything or nothing, and for years it meant nothing. The community of Brier Hollow reacted to Rebecca's disappearance with the kind of unity small towns muster only during tragedy. Volunteers organized meal trains for her mother, church bulletins carried weekly prayer requests, and Bring Becca Home flyers appeared on every telephone pole. But beneath the surface, fault lines deepened. Rumors spread that Rebecca had been having an affair with a married co-worker. Others whispered that she'd been planning to leave town, possibly to attend a culinary school in New York, though her application paperwork had never been found. The gossip wasn't malicious, just the town's way of making sense of the incomprehensible. By late summer, media interest waned, and the posters began to curl in the rain. Detective Danner continued pursuing leads long after the official task force disbanded. He interviewed drifters, cross-referenced missing persons reports from neighboring states, and requested satellite imagery from NOAA archives hoping to identify tire marks or heat signatures from March 12, 2005. Each avenue ended in frustration. The Vermont State Police quietly reclassified the case as inactive in 2007. Danner retired 2 years later, leaving behind a meticulously labeled case file that filled 3 boxes. In his final memo, he wrote one line that would haunt future investigators. She didn't walk away. Someone carried her. For nearly 15 years, Rebecca Hale's disappearance existed as a ghost story in Brier Hollow. Children dared each other to walk County Route 19 at night. The Red Barn Inn rebuilt its image as a wedding venue, though staff avoided mentioning the vanished apprentice. Martha Hale grew older and quieter, her life defined by absence. Every March, she placed a wreath of dried maple leaves near the ditch where Rebecca's phone had been found. The locals learned to stop asking why. But in 2020, the quiet began to crack. Advances in trace DNA recovery technology prompted the Vermont State Police Cold Case Unit to reopen several unsolved disappearances, including Rebecca's. The white fabric strip preserved in the evidence locker for 15 years was retested using enhanced touch DNA techniques capable of extracting genetic material from minute skin cell residues. The results, delivered on November 6, 2020, contained a partial male DNA profile. It wasn't enough to identify a suspect, but it was enough to compare. The profile was uploaded to CODIS and to a national genealogy database used by forensic analysts. Within 6 months, a genealogical connection emerged, a distant relative of someone living less than 30 miles from Brier Hollow. The name that surfaced shocked the community to its core, linking the 15-year-old mystery to a man who'd lived among them all along, a man whose property bordered the very trail where Rebecca was last seen. The investigation that had lain dormant longer than Rebecca had been alive was about to wake, and when it did, it would reveal that the truth had been sitting quietly in a wooden cabin overlooking the same frozen river where volunteers once searched for a girl who'd never made it home. When Detective Laura Merritt received the cold case file for Rebecca Hale in early 2021, she wasn't expecting it to consume her life. Merritt had joined the Vermont State Police Cold Case Unit after a decade in forensics, specializing in trace evidence and environmental contamination analysis. Her assignment was supposed to be routine: review dormant cases for potential re-examination using newly available DNA technology, write a report, and move on. But the Hale file was different. From the first page, the contradictions were magnetic. A disappearance without footprints. A phone found ringing in snow that should have muffled the sound. A car locked from the outside, but without prints on the handles. It wasn't the lack of evidence that drew her in. It was the illusion of order. Everything about the scene looked staged, too clean for rural Vermont in March, too symmetrical to be random. She'd worked enough homicide scenes to know that real violence was messy, but this looked almost curated. Merritt began by meeting with the retired detective who had led the original investigation, Paul Danner. He was 71 now, living quietly in Montpelier, his memory sharp, but his tone weighted with regret. They met at a diner off Route 2, the kind of place that hadn't changed its wallpaper since the 1980s. Danner brought a battered notebook, its corners softened from years of use. He turned to a page marked March 13, 2005, and tapped his pen against a line of handwritten notes. "You see this?" he said. "Wind speed, 12 miles an hour from the northwest. Temperature, 28 degrees. Snow accumulation, less than an inch. There should have been footprints even if she was dragged." He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Unless someone knew how to erase them." Merritt asked what he meant, and Danner described a conversation he'd had years earlier with Douglas Pierce, the retired forest ranger whose house sat along the route Rebecca would have walked that day. "Pierce mentioned snow compaction techniques," Danner said. "He told me once that hunters sometimes drag a tarp over tracks to smooth them out. Makes it look like fresh drift." Said it as a general comment, but it stuck with me. At the time, Danner hadn't considered Pierce a viable suspect. He'd been cooperative, provided alibis, and passed a polygraph. But something about the old ranger's calm had always bothered him. Back in Burlington, Merritt retrieved the preserved evidence from the Hale investigation, 37 items sealed in aging brown paper bags. Among them was the strip of white fabric that had produced the partial male DNA profile. Using newer micro-extraction methods, Merritt and lab technician James Rivera attempted to amplify the degraded genetic material. The first 3 runs failed, the DNA too fragmented. On the 4th, under ultraviolet light, Rivera noticed a faint residue on the edge of the fabric, a translucent substance fluorescing pale green. Chemical analysis identified it as pine resin mixed with trace amounts of automotive grease, a combination consistent with forestry or maintenance work. The discovery didn't prove guilt, but it hinted at occupational overlap. Someone who worked outdoors, used mechanical equipment, and had reason to handle both sap and oil. Merritt's mind immediately returned to Douglas Pierce, the former ranger and volunteer mechanic for the County Snowmobile Club. On March 9, 2021, Merritt drove to Brier Hollow to meet him. The town looked almost unchanged from the photos in the case file. The Red Barn Inn still stood, its paint faded, but its sign freshly hung for the tourist season. The air smelled faintly of thawing earth and diesel from nearby tractors. Pierce's house sat half a mile down a dirt road, a squat wooden structure surrounded by birch trees and old logging equipment. He was 80 now, lean and leathery, his eyes the pale blue of river ice. He invited her in with the slow politeness of someone who had spent years waiting for this visit. "You folks still looking for that girl?" he asked. Merritt nodded, scanning the interior. The cabin was meticulously tidy. Tools hung in precise order along the wall. A pair of snowshoes leaned against the door. On a shelf, dozens of glass jars filled with sap samples gleamed in the dim light. Pierce poured coffee and spoke with the ease of a man used to being interviewed. He repeated his alibi from 2005 almost word for word. He'd been stacking firewood behind the barn between 4 and 5, came inside around 6 to make dinner, watched the local news, went to bed early. His tone never faltered, but when Merritt mentioned the new DNA evidence, a flicker crossed his expression, a momentary tightening around the eyes, the kind of involuntary reaction training couldn't suppress. Merritt requested a voluntary DNA sample, explaining it was standard procedure for anyone previously interviewed in the case. Pierce hesitated only a second before agreeing. He swabbed his cheek under her supervision, signed the consent form, and handed it back with a faint smile. "You won't find anything, Detective," he said. "I've got nothing to hide." Merritt thanked him and left, but as she reached her car, she noticed something odd. The gravel driveway showed 2 distinct sets of tire impressions, one belonging to her vehicle, the other much deeper, wider, as if from a heavy-duty truck that had turned around several times before leaving. She photographed the tracks and made a note in her log. The sample reached the Burlington Forensic Lab 3 days later. The comparison took less than 12 hours. The partial profile extracted from the fabric matched Douglas Pierce's DNA at 11 of 13 loci, statistically significant enough to establish a probable link. The report landed on Merritt's desk at 8:42 a.m. on March 15th. She read it twice, the words sinking in like ice. The case that had stumped 2 generations of detectives now had a suspect, and that suspect had been living quietly in the same house less than a mile from where Rebecca vanished. The following day, Merritt obtained a search warrant for Pierce's property. The search began at dawn on March 17th under a low gray sky that promised rain. Forensic teams methodically swept the cabin, the barn, and the surrounding acreage. Inside the barn, they found a collection of old forestry tools, saws, chains, metal drums, tarps, all meticulously cleaned. Beneath the workbench, an evidence technician noticed a small wooden chest, its lid sealed with layers of aging duct tape. When opened, it revealed an assortment of objects wrapped in cloth. A silver locket engraved with the initials RH, a single chef's knife with a cracked wooden handle, and a photograph of Rebecca Hale taken at the Red Barn Inn kitchen in 2004, her name tag visible. Each item was carefully bagged and logged. Outside, a cadaver dog signaled near a patch of disturbed soil behind the barn. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed irregularities consistent with buried objects. Excavation revealed what appeared to be a shallow pit, partially collapsed by years of frost. At 2 feet depth, searchers uncovered fragments of decayed fabric and bone. The remains were transported to the Vermont office of the chief medical examiner. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Helena Vargas conducted the analysis. The bones, though incomplete, showed characteristics consistent with a female in her mid-20s. Dental records confirmed the identity within 48 hours. Rebecca Hale. 15 years after she vanished, she had finally been found less than half a mile from where she was last seen. The autopsy determined cause of death as blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with a single blow from a heavy object. There were no defensive wounds, suggesting she had been caught off guard. Fragments of pine bark embedded in the bone matched the species found around Pierce's property. Merritt returned to Brier Hollow on March 21st to make the arrest. She found Pierce sitting on his porch, sharpening a knife, his movements slow and deliberate. When she read him his rights, he didn't protest. He simply nodded as if acknowledging a debt long due. "I figured this day might come," he said quietly. "It's hard keeping ghosts quiet forever." In the interrogation room at the Waterbury Barracks, Pierce spoke for nearly 3 hours. His story was fragmented, meandering, but the core was clear. He claimed Rebecca had stopped by his house on the afternoon of March 12th to ask about using his sugar boiler for a maple reduction experiment, something she'd mentioned during a previous conversation at the inn. They argued when he refused, and she threatened to report him for hunting without a permit, a claim that seemed implausible, but plausible enough in his fading mind. He said she slipped on the frozen steps and struck her head. "It was an accident," he repeated. "I panicked. I thought nobody would believe me, so I made her disappear." Investigators doubted the story. The location of the wound, the meticulous staging of the disappearance, the erasure of footprints, none of it fit the impulsive panic of an accident. What it fit was a pattern of control, a man accustomed to the woods, to erasing signs of movement, to managing what others could see. Pierce's life history revealed more troubling details. During the 1980s, as a ranger, he'd been quietly disciplined for inappropriate conduct toward a female volunteer. an incident buried in personnel files and never prosecuted. His wife had disappeared in 1991 under circumstances officially attributed to a hiking accident near Lake Champlain. No body had ever been recovered. With Rebecca's remains now found and physical evidence linking him to the crime, prosecutors prepared charges for second-degree murder, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. News of the arrest spread through Vermont within hours. Local television crews descended on Brier Hollow, filming the same stretch of County Route 19 that had once been covered in snow and police tape. Neighbors expressed disbelief. "Doug helped fix my roof last year," one woman said. "He brought firewood every winter. How could he?" The sentence never finished. Others admitted that something about him had always seemed too calm, too careful. At the Red Barn Inn, employees gathered in the dining room, watching the live coverage in silence. The inn's owner, now in his 70s, wept openly. "She was like family," he told reporters. "We thought she'd just walked away. Turns out she never left." For Detective Merritt, the case's resolution was both triumph and burden. In her final report, she wrote that what haunted her most wasn't the brutality of the crime, but its geography. The way the boundaries of Brier Hollow contained everything. The victim, the killer, the search, the silence. "She vanished from a half-mile road," Merritt wrote, "and for 15 years no one looked close enough." Yet even as Pierce awaited trial, questions lingered. His account of events changed subtly each time he spoke. Sometimes he said he'd buried her that same night. Other times he claimed he moved the body days later after the snow melted. He seemed confused about whether anyone had helped him, whether his nephew had visited that weekend, whether someone else knew. Investigators began to suspect that the story of Rebecca Hale's death might not end with Douglas Pierce, that the forest around Brier Hollow still held secrets no one had yet uncovered. The arraignment of Douglas Pierce on March 29, 2021 drew more people to the Granger County Courthouse than any trial in recent memory. Reporters packed the narrow hallway outside Courtroom B, cameras balanced on tripods, microphones angled like rifles. Inside, the retired ranger sat in an orange jumpsuit that looked almost absurd against his weathered skin and sun-beaten hands. He seemed smaller now, diminished by the fluorescent light and the polished wood of the benches. When the clerk read the charge, second-degree murder of Rebecca Hale, concealment of a corpse, obstruction of justice, he didn't flinch. His attorney, a weary public defender named Michael Kearney, entered a plea of not guilty, citing advanced age, possible cognitive decline, and the absence of clear intent. The courtroom murmured. It was the first time Brier Hollow's residents had seen Pierce stripped of the quiet authority he'd carried for decades. Some whispered prayers. Others just stared, searching his face for the man they thought they'd known. Detective Laura Merritt sat in the second row, her hands folded around a pen she wasn't using. The state's attorney, Evelyn Caro, leaned over to whisper that the DNA evidence, though compelling, would face challenges. The sample recovered from the fabric strip was partial, degraded, and the defense could argue contamination. "We'll need to build the case around context," Caro said. "Pattern of behavior, circumstantial consistency, motive." Merritt nodded. She knew the science was the key that had unlocked the door, but it wouldn't hold the weight alone. They needed story, a narrative that made sense of the evidence, the silence, the years. As the hearing adjourned, Pierce turned briefly toward the gallery. His gaze swept the room until it found Martha Hale sitting in the front row. Her hair had turned white since the first press conference 16 years earlier, but her eyes were the same, sharp, deliberate, almost defiant. Pierce's expression shifted just enough to register recognition or maybe guilt before the deputies led him away. Outside, the cold March air carried the smell of thawing mud and maple smoke. Reporters swarmed Martha as she stepped down the courthouse stairs. "Do you feel justice has been served?" someone shouted. She paused, steadying herself on the railing. "Justice doesn't bring her back," she said. "It just stops the pretending." In the weeks that followed, Merritt and the prosecution team worked to reconstruct the events of March 12, 2005. The challenge was time, 15 years of weather, rot, and fading memory. Witnesses who'd once been sharp now struggled with dates and details. The original Red Barn Inn staff had scattered across the state. Some had died, some refused to talk, and others confessed they'd simply forgotten. Merritt spent long nights in the evidence room, rereading statements and photographs. The pattern that emerged wasn't one of impulse, but of proximity and opportunity. Pierce lived directly along the route Rebecca walked. He had access to the tools that could manipulate snow and soil. He had a history of boundary violations with women, buried in old personnel reports, and the locket found in his workshop, engraved with Rebecca's initials, had been confirmed by Martha as her daughter's. It was a small, precise web that held together even under scrutiny. Still, something about Pierce's confession gnawed at Merritt. The inconsistencies were too specific to be dismissed as old age. He remembered details that only an investigator would know: the position of Rebecca's car, the placement of her phone, but confused others that seemed fundamental, like the color of her coat or the time of day. During one interview, he claimed he'd moved the body when the moon was full, but lunar records from March 2005 showed no full moon until the 25th. Another time, he mentioned 2 shovels, not 1, though only 1 had ever been recovered. It suggested either memory decay or shared involvement. Merritt began re-examining the original interviews for anyone who might have been connected to Pierce in ways investigators hadn't seen. The name that kept resurfacing was Caleb Hart, the sous chef who'd spoken to Rebecca minutes before she disappeared. Hart had been 29 in 2005, ambitious, known for his temper, but respected for his skill. He'd left the Red Barn Inn a year after Rebecca's disappearance and moved to New Hampshire, where he now ran a small catering company. His name appeared only briefly in Danner's notes, but one entry caught Merritt's attention. Dated March 20th, 2005, it read, "Hart knows more than he's saying. Mentioned working late that night, but no record of clock-out time. Claimed power outage erased logs. Danner had followed up, but the inn's timekeeping system had indeed glitched during the blizzard, and the lead went nowhere." Merritt requested Hart's employment records, financial statements, and any connection to Douglas Pierce. What emerged was faint but undeniable. Both men were members of the same volunteer search group during the initial investigation. They had spent several days together scouring the woods around Brier Hollow. Photographs from local newspapers showed them side by side, bundled in parkas, holding maps. It wasn't unusual, but Merritt noticed something else. In one photo, taken on March 17, 2005, Pierce wore a pair of gloves identical to those later recovered from the Red Barn Inn's Lost and Found. Inside one of those gloves, archived for years, forensic techs had noted a faint brown stain that had never been analyzed. Using modern spectroscopy and mitochondrial DNA amplification, the lab identified the stain as dried blood, human, female, and a partial mitochondrial match to Rebecca Hale. The gloves were cross-referenced with the inn's employee inventory logs, which showed they belonged to kitchen staff. Merritt's pulse quickened. If Pierce had been wearing them, how had he gotten them? When questioned after his arrest, he'd denied knowing anyone from the Red Barn Inn personally. Merritt confronted him again, this time in the interview room at the county detention center. "Doug," she said, "we found blood on the gloves you wore during the search. They were Rebecca's. How'd they get to you?" Pierce stared at the table, his jaw trembling slightly. "They were given to me," he whispered. "For the cold. I didn't know. Given by who?" Merritt pressed. The old man's eyes lifted, pale and frightened. "Caleb," he said. "The cook. He brought them from the inn." The statement hit like a fault line opening beneath the investigation. Merritt verified that Caleb Hart had indeed participated in the volunteer search that week. He'd brought supplies, coffee, extra gloves, items the townspeople remembered gratefully. But Pierce's implication changed everything. If Hart had given him those gloves after the disappearance, it meant he'd had access to them when they were already contaminated with Rebecca's blood. The timeline shifted. Hart wasn't just a witness. He might have been present during or after the killing. Merritt contacted the New Hampshire State Police requesting surveillance assistance. Hart's catering business operated out of a converted farmhouse near Keene. He lived alone, no prior arrests, no record of violence. But within days of the request, Merritt received a call from his assistant. Hart had abruptly closed the business, claiming a family emergency, and hadn't returned. His phone went straight to voicemail. A be-on-the-lookout bulletin was issued statewide. 3 days later, a highway patrol unit in Vermont spotted a blue Ford Ranger registered to Hart parked on a forest access road near the Winooski River, less than 2 miles from where Rebecca's body had been found. Merritt and a tactical team arrived at dawn. They found Hart's truck empty, doors unlocked, a half-finished bottle of whiskey in the passenger seat. Snow had fallen overnight, but faint tracks led down toward the river. Following them, the team discovered a small campfire still smoldering beneath a rocky overhang. Beside it lay a backpack containing identification, cash, and a folded letter addressed to whoever finds this. The letter was brief, written in uneven handwriting that wavered between confession and justification. I didn't mean for any of it to happen. Doug wanted to scare her, make her stop talking about what she saw at the inn. She fell, hit her head. He panicked. I helped him because I was afraid he'd blame me. We thought the snow would hide it. We thought no one would ever find her. The note ended without signature. Forensic comparison confirmed Hart's fingerprints on the paper. Later that day, a state trooper found his body floating downstream, snagged in tree roots along the riverbank. The autopsy ruled it a suicide by hypothermia and alcohol intoxication. The revelation transformed the case narrative again. Pierce's confession, previously seen as delusional, now aligned with new evidence. He hadn't acted alone. The reference to what she saw at the inn prompted investigators to re-examine the Red Barn. Inn's employment records from 2005, a missing inventory log revealed that 2,400 worth of imported truffles and wine had been unaccounted for that February. Hart had managed the storeroom. Rebecca, known for her meticulousness, had likely discovered the theft and confronted him. The confrontation may have reached Pierce through gossip or friendship. Hart could have enlisted him to intimidate her, leveraging the older man's local authority. What began as a confrontation escalated to homicide, the cleanup disguised as disappearance. When confronted with Hart's letter, Pierce broke down completely. He sobbed for nearly an hour before murmuring, "He told me it was just to talk." She slipped and there was blood, and then everything went quiet. I didn't know what else to do. The prosecution amended the indictment to include conspiracy and accessory charges, though Pierce's advanced age made a full trial uncertain. Nevertheless, Vermont's Attorney General insisted the case proceed. "The people of this state deserve to see accountability," she said at a press conference. Rebecca Hale deserves her name back. Martha Hale attended every hearing, sitting in the same front row seat. Each time she wore the locket returned from evidence, the silver polished bright again. The townspeople who once avoided her now greeted her with nods, small gestures of apology for the years of silence. The Red Barn Inn installed a memorial plaque in the kitchen, a simple inscription, "In memory of Rebecca Hale, her hands made light out of sugar and fire." The trial began in August 2021. Pierce's defense centered on diminished capacity and manipulation by Caleb Hart, arguing that he'd been coerced and mentally unstable. The prosecution presented forensic timelines, financial records, and the recovered confession. Expert witnesses detailed the snow compaction techniques, the soil composition matching Pierce's property, and the DNA from the fabric strip. The courtroom filled with journalists again, their stories now less about mystery and more about reckoning. When the verdict was read on September 2nd, guilty on all counts, Pierce closed his eyes and whispered something no one could hear. He was sentenced to 25 years in state prison, effectively a life term. Detective Merritt stood outside the courthouse afterward, the late summer wind carrying the scent of rain through the valley. Reporters crowded around her, asking how she felt solving a case that had haunted the state for 15 years. She said only, "Closure isn't the same as peace." In her mind, she saw the map of Brier Hollow, the road, the inn, the cabin, the river, and how all of it fit within a single mile. So much pain, so much waiting contained in such a small piece of land. She thought of Rebecca's footprints that had never existed, of the false perfection of that first scene. It had always been a lie. But even as the case closed, one final detail refused to rest. In the evidence from Pierce's workshop, technicians cataloged a small key attached to a faded leather tag labeled simply Locker 17. It didn't match any known property or storage facility in Brier Hollow. When Merritt ran the number through state databases, nothing came up. She set it aside, one more artifact in a story already too full of ghosts. But somewhere in Vermont, there was still a locker waiting to be opened, and whatever it contained might reveal that Rebecca Hale's disappearance had never been the first, only the one that someone finally decided to uncover. The key to Locker 17 sat on Detective Laura Merritt's desk for 6 weeks before she could bring herself to deal with it. The case had technically been closed, conviction secured, files archived. Rebecca Hale's remains finally returned to her mother for burial on a bright October morning that smelled faintly of sap and wet leaves. The world had moved on. But Merritt couldn't. She kept replaying the chain of evidence in her mind. The way the key had been tagged separately from the other items recovered from Pierce's barn, almost like it had been meant to be found. The label's faded handwriting didn't match Pierce's tidy block script. It was looser, looped, almost decorative, feminine, or at least youthful. Merritt had shown a photograph of it to Martha Hale during one of their last meetings. Martha had studied it for a long time before shaking her head. "Becca didn't write her sevens like that," she'd said. "But I've seen that style before, on the inn's order forms. The ones Caleb filled out. That had been enough to keep Merritt awake that night, staring at the key's dull brass teeth catching the glow of her desk lamp. Locker 17. It was too specific to ignore. She began by tracing every storage facility within a 50-mile radius of Brier Hollow that had operated in 2005. There were 6, 3 still open, 3 defunct. After 2 weeks of calls, paperwork requests, and database queries, she found a match. Green Valley Self-Storage, 20 miles north near Bar, still in operation under the same ownership. The facility's manager, a wiry man named Owen Keeler, checked his old records. 17, huh? He muttered, flipping through a ledger thick with dust. Rented in 04, closed out 06. Name on the lease was Caleb Hart. Merritt's pulse quickened. Was the unit cleared after it closed? She asked. Keeler frowned. No, we lock him up when rent's unpaid. Wait for legal clearance before auction. But this one never got auctioned. Some court hold from years back, don't remember why. It's still sealed. The next day, Merritt drove to Bar with a warrant signed by the state's attorney. The facility sat on a windswept hillside, rows of metal doors stretching toward the woods. Unit 17 was near the end, its padlock rusted and the number half worn away. Keeler watched as she cut the lock and rolled up the door. The interior smelled of dust, motor oil, and faint sweetness, maple, maybe, or rot. A single overhead bulb flickered to life, revealing a narrow corridor of stacked crates, toolboxes, and cardboard boxes labeled in the same looping handwriting as the key tag. The temperature inside was cold enough to fog her breath. The first box she opened contained old kitchen equipment, knives, pans, ladles stamped with the Red Barn Inn logo. Another held stacks of faded photographs, group shots of the inn's staff, festival parades, county fairs. In one, Merritt saw Rebecca laughing beside Caleb Hart, both wearing chef whites, sunlight glinting off the stainless steel counters behind them. Beneath that stack was a small envelope marked recipes. Inside were handwritten notes that weren't recipes at all, but lists of dates. Initials and vague phrases. JM. Supplies missing. DP handled. KG. Threatened to call police. EP. Moved to New Hampshire. There were 7 entries spanning 12 years. Merritt felt her stomach tighten. She recognized at least one name, Ellen Porter, a waitress who'd gone missing from Montpelier in 1998, her case never solved. Further back in the unit, a large wooden crate sat covered with a tarp. The smell grew stronger as she lifted it. Inside were sealed glass jars filled with thick amber liquid. At first glance it looked like maple syrup, each jar labeled by year. 1996, 1998, 2001, 2005. Floating in each was something pale and distorted. Merritt's hands began to shake. She called for backup, her voice low and steady even as her heart raced. When evidence technicians arrived, they cataloged the jars under biohazard protocols. Analysis later confirmed the liquid wasn't syrup, but a mixture of resin and ethanol, a crude preservative. The contents of the 2005 jar were fragments of human tissue, consistent with dermal samples taken from Rebecca Hale. The other jars contained remains from unidentified victims. The discovery tore open the quiet equilibrium Vermont had built around Rebecca's case. Overnight, the press transformed it from a single solved homicide into a serial investigation spanning decades. State police established a task force and Merritt was placed at its head. Her office filled with reporters, forensic analysts, and agents from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. The working theory emerged quickly. Caleb Hart and Douglas Pierce had been involved in multiple disappearances, possibly covering for one another. The pattern was chilling. Women who worked in hospitality or seasonal industries, all within a 50-mile radius, all gone without a trace. The jars in Locker 17 weren't trophies in the usual sense. They were records, samples preserved like a chef cataloging ingredients. Forensic genealogy work began immediately. By December 2021, DNA analysis identified 2 of the other samples. One belonged to Ellen Porter, confirming Merritt's suspicion. The other matched a partial familial profile linked to a missing college student named Janine Merrill, who'd vanished from Bar in 2001. Her family had always believed she'd run away to Boston. Now they knew the truth. The remaining jar, labeled 1996, contained degraded tissue that resisted analysis, but chemical traces suggested it had been submerged in the preservative for nearly 25 years. When confronted with the Locker 17 evidence, Pierce initially denied any knowledge of it. "I never saw those things," he told Merritt during a prison interview, his voice trembling. Caleb kept secrets. "I did what he asked, but I never knew why." Merritt studied his eyes. They were pale, watery, but not confused. "Doug, you said you buried Rebecca behind your barn," she said. "You didn't mention jars." He shook his head violently. "He told me to dig. I dug. That's all." The medical examiner's office confirmed that Rebecca's remains had been incomplete, small sections of tissue missing, possibly cut away post-mortem. The implication was nauseating. The public's reaction oscillated between horror and disbelief. Local news ran retrospectives on every unsolved disappearance in Vermont between 1995 and 2005. Families called hotlines with old suspicions. The Red Barn Inn closed permanently that winter, its reputation unsalvageable. Martha Hale, now a reluctant public figure, appeared on television pleading for privacy. "She's at rest," she said. "Let her stay there. Don't make her a symbol." But the story had already escaped her control. It became the Maple County Murders, a term coined by a Boston journalist who described the crimes as a perverse intersection of hospitality, isolation, and obsession with preservation. Meanwhile, Merritt's investigation widened. She combed through financial records for both Pierce and Hart, searching for overlaps that could explain logistics. One discovery stood out. In 1998, both men had been subcontracted by the State Forestry Department for trail maintenance near Waterbury, the same area where Ellen Porter disappeared that summer. Payroll logs placed them on duty the week she vanished. Pierce's truck mileage, logged manually, matched the distance to Porter's last known location. The coincidence solidified into pattern. In January 2022, Merritt received a letter from Pierce's attorney requesting a private meeting. When she arrived at the state prison infirmary, Pierce looked frail, his skin translucent, oxygen tube hissing softly beside him. "I won't live much longer," he said, his voice a rasp. "There's something you need to find." He handed her a folded map drawn in shaky pencil. It showed the forest bordering his old property, a small X marked beside a stream. He called it the root cellar, Pierce whispered. Said it was where he kept things that didn't belong anywhere else. Merritt asked if it was more victims. Pierce's eyes glistened. "I never looked," he said. "I didn't want to know." The search took place 2 days later, in sub-zero temperatures that cracked the ground like glass. Merritt trudged through knee-deep snow alongside cadaver dogs and forensic archaeologists. The map led them to a hollow between 2 maples, the soil frozen and uneven. Beneath a layer of rotted boards, they found a narrow shaft descending 6 feet into the earth. Inside were metal shelves lined with sealed glass containers, smaller than the ones from Locker 17. Each held meticulously labeled items, fragments of jewelry, scraps of uniforms, pieces of notebooks, even a single Polaroid photograph of a woman standing beside a sugar boiler. The image was dated 1994. Forensic cataloging confirmed at least 5 distinct victims represented by personal effects in the root cellar. None corresponded to known missing persons reports, though the Polaroid subject was later identified through aging facial recognition as Nancy LeDuc, a seasonal worker who had disappeared from Brier Hollow 11 years before Rebecca Hale. The cumulative evidence painted a chilling picture. Caleb Hart and Douglas Pierce had operated together for over a decade, preying on women in transient jobs, using the cover of Vermont's seasonal economy to make their victims vanish. Pierce's role had been containment, burial, cleanup, silence. Hart's had been selection and ritual preservation. Together, they'd built an illusion of ordinary life that fooled an entire community. The Attorney General held a press conference in February 2022, announcing the discovery of additional victims and the reopening of related cases statewide. Standing behind her, Merritt felt the weight of every headline. Reporters called her the detective who unearthed Vermont's buried past, a phrase that made her skin crawl. She hadn't unearthed anything, she thought. The truth had been sitting just below the surface all along, waiting for someone to stop accepting the impossible as mystery. In March, Douglas Pierce died in custody, complications from pneumonia. His death left unanswered questions that would never be resolved in court. He was buried without ceremony in the state prison cemetery. Merritt didn't attend, though she received a small padded envelope from his attorney a week later. Inside was a handwritten note in that same shaky scrawl. They were all his recipes. I just kept the fire going. By summer, the investigation's active phase wound down. The Locker 17 evidence had been fully processed, the root cellar sealed as a memorial site. DNA analysis confirmed 6 victims in total. Vermont's governor announced a special inquiry into law enforcement failures that had allowed 2 men to operate unnoticed for so long. Funding was allocated for rural missing persons protocols and forensic training. For Martha Hale, none of it mattered. She told Merritt quietly, "It doesn't make the nights quieter. It just changes what you dream about." In August 2022, Merritt drove once more to Brier Hollow. The Red Barn Inn stood abandoned, windows boarded, parking lot overgrown with weeds. The silence felt heavier than before, not from mystery but from knowing. She walked down County Route 19, the same path Rebecca had taken 17 years earlier. The air smelled of pine and distant rain. At the bend in the road, where the trees opened to a view of the Winooski River, she stopped and listened. There was nothing, just wind, water, and the echo of everything that had happened here. She thought about leaving the key on Rebecca's grave, but she kept it instead, tucking it into her coat pocket. Not as evidence anymore, but as reminder. Cases don't end, she realized. They just change shape. The truth of Rebecca Hale's disappearance had started as one story, a woman gone from a locked car, but beneath it lay another, then another until the whole town's history folded inward like layers of frozen soil. Somewhere out there were still people who'd sat across from Hart and Pierce at bar counters, shared meals with them, trusted them. That was the final cruelty. Not just what they'd done, but how easily they'd blended in. As Merritt turned back toward her car, dusk settling over the valley, the first drops of rain began to fall. They hit the road softly, erasing her footprints almost as soon as they appeared. For a moment she watched the water blur everything, the tire ruts, the weeds, the gravel, until the ground looked smooth again, like untouched snow. And she thought, maybe that's why it took so long. Because the world is very good at covering its own tracks, and the truth only survives if someone keeps digging long after the rest of us are too tired to look. The following winter, Brier Hollow returned to its strange rhythm of silence. The tourists stopped coming after the television crews left, and the snow reclaimed everything. The signs, the fields, the unpaved road where the story had started. What used to be whispers about Rebecca Hale became something heavier, unspoken, like a shadow people refused to step into. The townsfolk fixed their roofs, tended their wood stoves, and spoke of the weather instead. But the wounds remained visible to anyone who knew where to look. The boarded windows of the Red Barn Inn, the dark stain that still marked the dirt where Pierce's barn had been excavated, the wreaths that appeared every March without a name. Detective Laura Merritt stayed in contact with Martha Hale, visiting her small house in Rutland once a month. They'd sit by the window with tea, the air between them filled with the quiet understanding of people who had both lost something they would never get back. Martha had grown frail, but her mind was sharp. She'd started keeping a notebook, recording the little memories of Rebecca that had survived the years. The smell of brown sugar in her hair after work, the way she used to hum while writing recipes, the chipped blue mug she refused to throw away. People talk about closure like it's a door, Martha told Merritt once. But doors can open again. What I have is a wall. It doesn't move. It doesn't forgive. The state's investigation into the Maple County murders concluded in late 2022, confirming 6 victims in total between 1994 and 2005. The Attorney General's report was clinical, almost bloodless, but Merritt read every page. It described Pierce and Hart's crimes as collaborative opportunism, a term that failed to capture the ritualistic precision she'd seen firsthand. The evidence from Locker 17 and the root cellar suggested not random acts but methodical processes. Dates aligning with seasonal employment schedules, geographical clustering around sugar camps and inns, consistent patterns of victim age and profession. These weren't opportunistic killings. They were curated. Every victim had been someone transient, someone whose absence could be rationalized. Students, seasonal workers, drifters. And every crime coincided with either a festival, a harvest, or an off-season lull when attention turned inward and people stopped looking outside. Merritt spent her evenings combing through the digital archives of missing persons cases from across New England. She started to notice familiar echoes, women who disappeared between February and April when the snow softened and tracks vanished overnight. One report from 1999 described a young pastry apprentice last seen near Lebanon, New Hampshire, whose car was found locked with her jacket folded inside. Another from Maine in 2003 involved a waitress walking home after a shift who vanished within sight of her porch. None were ever connected to Vermont, but the patterns were there if you knew what to look for. Short distance, low visibility, trust in small-town safety. In January 2023, Merritt was called to the state laboratory in Burlington for what the lead analyst described as anomalous residual data. The lab had been re-examining the 1996 sample from Locker 17, the one too degraded for standard DNA testing. Using new mitochondrial sequencing software, they managed to extract a faint genetic signal, enough to establish a maternal lineage link. The closest match was an unidentified Jane Doe discovered in 1997 along the Connecticut River, 30 miles south of the Vermont border. Her remains had never been claimed, her file archived under unknown adult female, age 2030. The revelation suggested that Hart and Pierce's crimes may have crossed state lines years before Rebecca Hale's murder, extending further than anyone had imagined. Merritt brought the findings to the FBI liaison assigned to the Maple County Task Force, Special Agent Marcus Quinn. Quinn was younger, methodical, unshakably calm, the kind of agent who viewed horror as data. "We could be looking at a larger network," he said, spreading the case photos across the conference table. Hospitality circuits are transient ecosystems. Workers migrate seasonally. If they were recruiting or identifying victims in one state and disposing of them in another, the pattern would vanish under jurisdictional lines. He paused, tapping the photo of the jars. The resin preservation, it's symbolic. He wasn't just hiding them. He was keeping them. He saw them as ingredients in a collection. Someone taught him that. That suggestion stuck with Merritt for weeks. Someone taught him. Hart's background had been scrubbed clean in every official record she checked. Standard education, no criminal history, no psychiatric holds. But a deeper look revealed he'd spent a year in culinary school in Montreal in the late 1990s. Cross-referencing enrollment data, Merritt found something that made her stomach turn. One of his instructors, a chef named Gérard Lemieux, had been dismissed in 1999 after accusations of harassment and unorthodox preservation methods during food science courses. Lemieux had since disappeared, last known to be traveling through Maine and Vermont on a consultancy circuit. By spring, Merritt had traced a trail of paperwork and rumor connecting Lemieux to several small inns and restaurants across northern New England. Most were long closed, but one, the Silver Birch Lodge near Woodstock, still operated under new ownership. The lodge's original maintenance manager, Douglas Pierce, in 1998. The overlap was undeniable. Lemieux, Hart, and Pierce had all worked within a 30-mile radius that year. The deeper Merritt dug, the clearer it became that what happened in Brier Hollow wasn't born there, it migrated there. She drove to Woodstock in April 2023 to interview the current owners of the Silver Birch Lodge. The building was old, its walls steeped in the smell of varnish and dust. The owners, an elderly couple, remembered Lemieux vaguely. He was strange, the wife said, obsessed with preserving things. He'd boil sap just to watch it reduce, then pour it over anything, flowers, fruit, even bits of meat. In the basement, Merritt found a narrow storage room still lined with wooden shelves coated in crystallized sugar. When she scraped a sample, the lab later confirmed trace DNA consistent with female tissue embedded in the syrup layers. The revelation that Lemieux might have originated the preservation ritual reframed everything. The Maple County murders were no longer an isolated collaboration between two men. They were the last echo of something older, A contagion passed through apprenticeship and imitation. The state reopened cases from as far back as 1994, and Merritt was invited to consult, though she'd already begun to feel the toll. Nights blurred into one another, the hum of fluorescent lights replacing sleep. She'd see the jars when she closed her eyes, floating fragments suspended in amber light. And sometimes she'd imagine hearing faint voices inside them, like air trapped beneath frozen water. In May, while reviewing archival footage of the Red Barn Inn's early festivals, Merritt noticed a figure in the background of several photographs. A man in his 50s, dark hair slicked back, standing near Hart in almost every frame. He wasn't listed among the staff or guests. She enhanced one still and sent it to Interpol for comparison. 2 weeks later, she got confirmation. The man was Gérard Lemieux. The timestamp was March 2004, a year before Rebecca Hale's disappearance. Lemieux had been there, in Brier Hollow, visiting the inn just months before the murder. No one had ever realized. Merritt's discovery hit the national news within days. Headlines read, "The mentor behind Vermont's most notorious killers." The FBI issued an international warrant, though Lemieux had vanished decades earlier. His passport activity ended in 2007, after which there was nothing, no records, no sightings, no body. Some believed he was dead. Merritt wasn't sure. She suspected he was alive, hiding under a new name, watching the aftermath of his legacy unfold on television. The Maple County case had become his final experiment, preservation through influence, ensuring that his methods lived on in others. That summer, the woods around Brier Hollow began to heal in the slow, indifferent way nature does. Wildflowers grew where police tape had once fluttered. The barn was demolished, its boards repurposed into firewood for local families. The Red Barn Inn's property was sold to the state and designated as a memorial garden, though most locals avoided it. Martha Hale visited once, placing Rebecca's old chef knife on a stone engraved with her name, then never returned. For Merritt, the investigation's end didn't bring relief. She'd been offered a promotion to head of forensic operations in Burlington, but she turned it down. She rented a cabin on the edge of Brier Hollow instead, near the same stretch of road where Rebecca's phone had been found. "It's quiet here," she told her supervisor. "I need quiet." But the quiet wasn't empty. It hummed with memory. Some nights, when the wind moved through the trees, she'd think she heard faint echoes of boiling sap, the same sound that had filled the valley the day Rebecca vanished. It wasn't haunting in the ghostly sense. It was the persistence of place, the way tragedy imprints itself into the air until the land itself remembers. On the anniversary of the case's closure, Merritt returned to the Winooski River Bridge with the key to Locker 17 still in her pocket. The river was thawing, ice breaking apart in slow silver sheets. She leaned over the railing, watching the current pull the fragments downstream. For a long time, she considered throwing the key in, ending the last tangible link to the case, but she couldn't. Not because of sentiment, but because she knew that somewhere, something was still unfinished. Lemieux was still missing, and if he was alive, he had taught more than 2 men. The thought wouldn't leave her. What if Brier Hollow wasn't the end of the story, but only a midpoint in a lineage that stretched across states, decades, generations? How many apprentices had watched, learned, and moved on? She imagined kitchens, shacks, roadside diners, small places where heat and sugar and flesh could blend unnoticed. She felt cold even in the spring air. When she finally walked back to her car, she glanced once more at the river and saw the reflection of the clouds shifting, pale and colorless, like snow beginning to fall again. In her journal that night, Merritt wrote a single line: "Some crimes don't end, they ferment." She closed the notebook, locked it in her drawer beside the key, and blew out the light. Outside, Brier Hollow slept under the sound of rain and wind, the valley quiet but never still, its silence the same kind that had hidden Rebecca Hale for 16 years. And in that silence, something unseen seemed to wait, patient as rot, enduring as winter, knowing that someday someone new would start boiling sap again. By the winter of 2024, the Maple County Task Force had been quietly dissolved. Its findings were published in a thick, red-bound report that landed on the shelves of police academies and criminology programs under the sterile title, Case File 77A, Cooperative Serial Homicides in Rural Environments. It read like anatomy, cold, factual, and indifferent to the lives it described. The world moved on again. Netflix adapted a sanitized version within a year, the kind that turns horror into consumption. The Red Barn Inn became a set, the blizzard recreated with digital snow. Detective Laura Merritt refused every interview request. Her silence frustrated producers and reporters alike, but she'd made peace with it. Some stories didn't need retelling. Some stories had already taken enough. Her resignation came quietly in February 2024. The letter was short, typed on department stationery. After 21 years in law enforcement, I'm leaving to pursue independent forensic consultation. The truth was less formal. She was tired, not of justice, but of what came after, the spectacle, the endless dissection of suffering for entertainment. She'd seen Rebecca's name on merchandise, her face stylized into podcast cover art. The same valley that had once searched for her now sold ghost tours retracing her final steps. Merritt stayed away from town after that. She moved to a small house near Lake Champlain, bought secondhand furniture, and filled the silence with small rituals. Coffee at dawn, long walks, letters to herself she never mailed. But the story didn't end there. In April, an envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid, an old kitchen countertop, a pot of boiling sap, and a small glass jar filled with amber liquid. On the back, written in that looping script she now knew too well, were the words, "The recipe continues." The photo was recent. The timestamp embedded in its film read March 2024. Merritt's stomach tightened. It wasn't fear exactly, more like recognition. She placed the photo under a lamp, studying the details. The countertop was modern, marble, not the rough wood of Vermont kitchens. The stove had a brand mark, Ardmore Hotel, Montreal. It took her 2 days to confirm that the Ardmore was real. A boutique hotel and culinary school hybrid on the outskirts of Montreal, opened in 2017. The executive instructor listed on its website? Chef Julien Marchand, age 51. The name meant nothing until she saw his photo. The face was older, softer, but unmistakable. It was Gérard Lemieux, under a new name. Merritt didn't call the bureau, not at first. She drove 8 hours north through sleet and fog, crossing the border with a passport that still listed her as detective. Montreal was gray that day, the air thick with exhaust and thawing snow. The Ardmore sat at the edge of an industrial district, its facade sleek glass and steel, banners advertising traditional preservation techniques in modern gastronomy. The irony made her almost laugh. She parked across the street and watched through the window as students in white aprons gathered around the man, once accused of teaching murder as if it were art. For 2 days, she observed. Lemieux, Marchand, was disciplined, precise. His lectures centered on fermentation, sugar crystallization, and culinary memory. He spoke softly, hands moving like a conductor's. She recorded everything. On the 3rd day she entered. A visitor badge, a borrowed accent, a lie about writing an article on regional culinary heritage. He greeted her warmly, polite, unassuming. His eyes, pale gray, gave away nothing. "You have an interest in preservation?" he asked in French. She nodded. "It's the only way to stop decay." He smiled, the faintest curl of satisfaction. She followed him through the kitchens, noting details. Jars lined on shelves, filled not with syrup this time but with herbs, citrus, petals. All harmless until she saw the back room. A glass chamber labeled experimentation storage. Inside, several sealed jars glowed under amber light. They were smaller, more delicate, but the color was the same. The smell, sweet and metallic, hit her instantly. Lemieux noticed her hesitation. "Old samples," he said. "Demonstrations for texture." She wanted to believe it. But she knew that smell. No simulation could recreate it. That night she called Special Agent Quinn. "He's here," she said. "Alive, teaching under a new name. And I think he's still doing it." Quinn listened quietly before responding. "Laura, you're out of jurisdiction. If you're right, we'll need coordination with RCMP and Interpol. Don't confront him." She promised she wouldn't. She lied. The next morning she returned to the Ardmore with a small camera hidden in her coat. The lobby was quiet. Through the kitchen door's small window she saw Lemieux speaking to a student, young, blonde, barely 20. He handed her a jar, smiled, said something she couldn't hear. The girl laughed, shy. Merritt's chest tightened. She waited until the class ended, then followed Lemieux into the alley behind the building, where he stepped out for a cigarette. "Chef Marchand," she said. He turned, surprise flickering across his face before it settled into calm recognition. Detective Merritt, he replied in perfect English. Or should I say former detective? I wondered when you'd arrive. Her pulse pounded. You sent the photo. He nodded. Of course. You had to see the evolution. You're still doing it, she said. Still teaching them. He took a slow drag, exhaled through his nose. Teaching? Yes. Doing? No. That's the difference between me and them. They misunderstood the art. Preservation was never about death. It was about control. About keeping something perfect. His eyes glinted. You of all people should understand that. You kept your case alive long after it was over. You preserved it. She felt the urge to draw her weapon, but she wasn't law enforcement anymore. You destroyed lives, she said. You taught them to destroy. Lemieux smiled faintly. They made choices. Everyone does. You chose to follow me here, didn't you? He flicked the cigarette into the snow, crushing it beneath his shoe. You should leave, detective. Some recipes are meant to be unfinished. He turned and walked back inside. By the time she called Quinn again, Lemieux was gone. His office cleared, his classes canceled, his name erased from the school's website within hours. The Montreal police found no trace of him, no fingerprints, no forwarding address, no record of employment under that name. It was as if he'd dissolved back into the air. Merritt returned home exhausted, the photo from the envelope still in her pocket. Months passed. She resumed her quiet routines, consulting occasionally on cold cases, none remotely like Brier Hollow. But the feeling of incompleteness persisted. Every jar she saw in markets, every amber bottle on a shelf pulled her back. Sometimes walking along Lake Champlain, she'd smell sugar burning faintly, though no one nearby was cooking. In July 2024, another envelope arrived. This one contained a single page torn from a culinary magazine. An article titled, "Preserving Heritage, the Art of Immortal Flavor," featured a smiling chef named Lucien M., face obscured by shadow, but the hands unmistakably Lemieux's. At the bottom, handwritten in looping script, "It's never the ingredients. It's the process." She didn't call anyone this time. She placed the page in her fireplace, struck a match, and watched it curl into ash. For a moment, she thought she heard faint laughter in the flame, but maybe it was just the wind through the chimney. When it was done, she poured herself coffee, opened her notebook, and wrote, "Some recipes survive by finding new kitchens." The final report of the Maple County investigation listed the case as resolved pending external leads. But Merritt knew better. There's no such thing as resolution. There's only what remains. The woods around Brier Hollow had grown quiet again, but silence, she'd learned, was deceptive. It's not peace, it's the sound of things waiting to be found. That fall, she visited Rebecca Hale's grave for the first time in over a year. The maple trees were turning red, and the air carried that same faint sweetness she remembered from the first day she'd read the case file. She placed the Locker 17 key on the headstone. It looked small against the granite, a meaningless artifact now, but she wanted to leave it behind. "We found what we could," she whispered. "The rest will find itself." As she turned to leave, a sound stopped her, a camera shutter, faint but distinct. She spun around. No one was there, only the trees swaying gently. On the ground near the cemetery gate, something glinted in the sunlight. A glass jar, palm-sized, empty except for a few granules of crystallized sugar clinging to its rim. A small label on its lid read, in looping handwriting, "For you." Merritt stood there for a long time, the wind cold against her face. She didn't touch the jar. She didn't have to. She understood. The story would continue without her. Somewhere, someone was already learning the recipe. When she finally walked away, the leaves whispered in the wind, their rustle soft but insistent, almost like voices repeating a single word carried through the valley. Again